Well, Finance Minister Dwight Duncan has just wrapped up his fall economic statement. And probably one of the most ruckus sessions I've seen in quite some time. And of course, Nick Bontis is here, an award-winning professor from the DeGroote School of Business. Let's get your thoughts on this. You were expecting to hear about the economy, about healthcare and education, and we really focused only on one of those three areas. So what do you make of this?
It was underwhelming, in my opinion. Spent about 85% of the time talking about the economy, jobs specifically, said not a peep about healthcare, not a peep about education. Those two are also very critical issues for the Ontario electorate. I want to play a little bit devil's advocate here, Taz, if I may. He talked specifically about how in Ontario, since the lowest low of the recession, that the Ontario government has now recovered 75% of the jobs they had originally lost. Devil's advocate would say, how about the 25% of the remaining Ontarians who still are without a job? He also talked about GDP growth a lot, saying that in 2010 our GDP growth was going to be 3.2% and that he was going to predict that our GDP growth in 2011 was going to be 2.2%. Playing devil's advocate, that means to me that the economy is actually going to slow down 1 full percentage point from this year to the next. So you actually have to read in between the lines when you analyze this particular case, and this is especially true when you hear about this energy deal that they're willing to offer.
And let's talk about that, because the government is promising a 10% reduction in your hydro rates. The only thing new about this is that we learned it doesn't just apply to families, but also to small businesses and farmers, which is quite considerable. And on the surface, it sounds great, $125 in the pocket for the average household, homeowner and small business. But the other number that's coming out is 46%. That is the amount that your hydro bill is expected to increase over 5 years. So let's do the math. You're the expert. Let's find out if we actually stand to save any money.
All right, so let's crunch the numbers very, very simply here. What he promised was 10% saving each year for 5 years. Multiply 10% by 5, that's 50% over the period of 5 years. On the flip side, the electricity bill is going to rise 46% over the next 5 years. In other words, prices are going to go up by 46% and we're going to have savings of 50%. When you net those two out, my simple math says that we will have a savings of 4% over the next 5 years, which translates to less than 1% per year. If you're averaging $250 and in terms of an energy bill per month for your household, that means you're barely going to put $2 back into your pocket. So although it sounded nice, 10% every year for 5 years, and let's face it, this is a signaling tactic, again, by this government, given that the election is 11 months away. When you read in between the lines, again, as a devil's advocate, it's not as big as you think, Taz.
And as you mentioned, there was no talk of removing the HST off hydro rates. Does that actually factor into the 46%? Are we going to be paying the HST, the 5% on top of the
No, I think
46?
that's included. Yeah, that's included. So all in, we're still just only saving a very, very small fraction of the amount. And you know what? The funny thing is, he actually pushed on that issue with regards to energy a lot. He actually mentioned about wind, and he mentioned about solar, and he talked about all these new, facilities all over Ontario, with these factories creating new jobs. Actually talked about 700 new wind turbines. So I think that's actually good news. But the interesting thing, when you kind of look at the way the message is being delivered, it's as if it was this government alone that was going to move to clean energy. That coal was dirty, and 25% of all of our energy resources back in the previous government was dirty coal. Well, guess what? Frankly, okay, Liberals, I understand that you're moving towards clean energy, but you know what? So would have any other government. I mean, this is the move that we're all making, is going towards clean energy. So to be able to actually attribute it just to yourself, saying, us Liberals, we did all these things.
Well, it is a very clever tactic, though, because a lot of us were wondering, why is this being called the clean energy benefit? And up until about 20 minutes ago, I had no idea why, and now we're seeing it. It was just one more reason to sort of talk about what apparently just the Liberals are doing. Well, where is the $1 billion going to come from? We've known for a while that it's going to be coming from TerraNet, the company that operates the province's land registry. So maybe you can explain that, because a lot of people are sitting back at home saying, I don't get it. Where is this extra $1 billion going to come from? How's it going to help us?
So think about actually the cell phone industry. It's a nice example. The federal government of Canada actually auctions off different wireless spectrums, and then the different cell phone companies actually bid for the privilege, the license, to have that spectrum in terms of an exclusive right period over a long period of time. So Rogers or Bell Mobility might bid billions of dollars to have the right to have your cell phone service over these next few years. This is what happened with TerraNet. They actually bid and actually signed a deal for 50 years to have an exclusive contract to actually register electronically all the land across Ontario, and that $1 billion is now going back into the coffers of the Ontario government.
Why
and what
would
the Ontario
TerraNet
government
do that? What's
because
the payoff
TerraNet aims to make more than the $1 billion over the next 50 years in terms of revenue contribution and profit. So it's a business deal.
Okay.
Let's not assume they're just giving $1 billion as a gift here. Just like any other cell phone company, if a cell phone company is willing to pay $10 billion for a spectrum, they aim to make $12 billion in revenue. So there's got to be some sort of margin in there. Now, the interesting thing about what the Liberals are doing is they're taking that $1 billion and they're assigning it directly to the $220 billion debt, which actually I think is a good thing, because that $220 billion debt is a very, very big number, and we have to keep on slicing it little by little by little. You know, we have difficulty just, you know, most governments around the world, especially now during low economic times, are having difficulty just paying the interest payments on debt. And here we are as Ontarians, and I think this is a very good move, and we can be proud of this as Ontarians, and we're actually going after some of that big principle. And that's a tough thing to do for government, when you could take that $1 billion and do a whole bunch of other things, like, you know, do something with healthcare or education, which they decided not to.
Well, let's talk about that. But $1 billion, when we're talking about $220 billion, that's not a huge chunk, though. I mean,
0.5%. 0.5%.
Is that going to do much to our...
Well, in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to actually get rid of all of our debt, but it's something in the right direction. And I go back to my original point, Taz. You know, normally when there's excess surplus in a government from a budget perspective, they're just going after interest payments. I mean, think of some of the problems with the countries in Europe, like Ireland, that we keep on hearing about. Think about what Greece had to go through last year. These guys are struggling just to pay the interest payments. Forget about the actual principal. So I'm going to go back and say, you know what, in terms of everything that I heard today, underwhelming overall, but the one positive news is actually going after the principal with the $1 billion.
In fact, that $1 billion is expected to lower interest costs by $50 million.
Yep.
So that is
Good
quite
news.
considerable.
Good news.
It's shocking that we're so used to talking in billion-dollar figures that it doesn't even faze us anymore.
Yeah.
What were you surprised? I mean, there were several moments where the Speaker had to tell MPPs to quiet down and sit down. In fact, there was a Hamilton East member that was specifically referenced, not by name, although we do know who it is.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen an economic update that got this ugly?
No, I haven't, and this is actually quite interesting because it's making politics a little bit more entertaining. It's fun to report on it, but it also re-emphasizes the point, again, that this was more than just a financial statement update, that this was in fact signaling for what's going to happen over the next 11 months. So what have we learned today? A couple things. Number one, energy is going to be a hot topic for this provincial election. You know what? Energy hasn't been a hot topic in maybe 3 or 4 provincial elections that I can remember going back. It was always, you know, the traditional ones, healthcare and jobs and education. So now all of a sudden we're moving now into this idea of, you know, what are we doing with wind turbines? What are we doing with solar energy?
But when they're expected to go up by nearly 50%, I think we all understand why.
Yeah, well, we're going to have to actually, not only in terms of the government, but also in terms of the average person living in Ontario, we're going to have to also start figuring out how do we conserve energy just in our own households. And then again, you know, timing is perfect. And of course, you know, the GM launches their IPO today and they're coming out with the Chevy Volt, Taz. And you know, the Chevy Volt, again, is in that same category of clean energy.
Unfortunately, we don't have time to keep talking about GM shares, although we will be back tomorrow.
Okay,
your regular
that's
Bontis on
right.
Business segment, and we will look back on the economic update. We'll talk about GM shares and many, many other things. So if you want to hear more, be sure to tune in at 4:30 tomorrow for our regular Bontis on Business segment.